the wonderful Zoom background that the rest of the presenters have to actually show up in my background. So I've incorporated it into my slides so that I am at least a little bit on theme today. So the piece that I'm going to talk about, and I'm very, very grateful, particularly Dr. Hermancia gave such a good overview of academic publishing and the state of play of scholarship and research in Indonesia. So that's very helpful. And then I will take that and provide an outsider's view. So I will offer a more global window into publishing, broadly speaking, globally. I'll mention as well, I'll stop if there are questions that you post in the Q&A. And if you do not want to pose your question in English, I'm sure we can translate it and go that way. So please feel free to ask any questions as we go along, and I'll stop at the end if there are particular questions that we want to talk about. Again, this gives the summary of what when the Turnitin team, who I and my company work with, asked me if I would take my experience as a professor and as a scholar, but also as somebody working in education technology, focusing on helping researchers and scholars, if I would be able to come and join this webinar today. I said, okay, these are the things that I can happily talk about. So this is my promise to you that we'll pick up on some of the things that have been discussed thus far in terms of what constitutes academic integrity and what behaviors are considered to be dishonest. We've seen some of that already this morning. And then what we'll really provide as well, as I mentioned, is an overview of some of the sort of international way people think about publication. And then realistically, what I will focus on is how to avoid making mistakes that can be problems with respect to academic integrity. So my assumption will be that as scholars, none of us want to cheat. None of us want to lie. None of us want to falsify our materials. Pak Lukman went through what happens, when research is redacted, when material is falsified. But sometimes each of the slides will have one of those sort of numbers so you can see where we are in the slideshow. So there's 6 sections in total. So if you get bored and can't follow, you'll be able to locate where we are just by looking at the slides. So we'll begin with the intro and overview. Again, this is just a summary. My hair was a little bit shorter in that picture because of COVID. I haven't been able to go get a haircut. So this is what it looks like when I've been indoors since March. But that's where you can find me on Twitter. If any of you are on Twitter already, I've noticed on my phone this morning that some of you have connected with me on LinkedIn, which is I'm more than happy to connect with you on LinkedIn as well. So by all means, feel free to find me online, and we can sort of continue the conversation beyond today, whether that's a conversation about academic integrity or just broadly speaking, keeping your research network as broad and global as possible. And I know that's very helpful for me as well. So we'll start with the big question. And again, as I say, this has been talked about this morning. So it's helpful because one of the things that I find when doing panels like this, if you're in agreement with everybody else on the panel, it reinforces the same message. And so again, we're talking about different kinds of academic dishonesty. This first one here that I've pulled out, which I think is a really helpful one and a really kind of good short quotation. And I should mention as well, I'll send these slides as a PowerPoint to the moderators once this is done so that they can disseminate it with you. So if you're, sort of following along and madly thinking you have to take notes while I talk, you don't. Well, I'll share all of this with you so that you have these resources. So plagiarism is hard to define in any precise way. At the simplest level, it is copying texts from other authors and using them as if they were their own. Now, one thing that I'll flag here as we define plagiarism, you'll note that I have cited where I got that quote from. So one of the things that you'll notice throughout the presentation is that as we talk about citing other scholars and contributing to an international community of researchers, you'll see me modeling these kinds of things along the way. Obviously, this presentation is not a scholarly article. I wouldn't make any of you read any of my scholarly articles. You would probably find them very boring. But what we'll see even in the slideshow is that commitment to attribute people's words to the right people. So this is a quotation that I found from another scholar who does a lot of work on how do you quantify and how do you research integrity in an academic context. And so as I say, at that simplest level, it's copying texts from other authors and using them as if they were their own. So as I say, I assume that as scholars, we all want to be honest and good and ethical in our work, but sometimes we make mistakes. We may, through an oversight, forget to cite somebody or not attribute. So these are some of the things that I'll give some sort of tactics and strategies for how to avoid making those kinds of mistakes. Now, this is from Turnitin itself as a company. They've aggregated this great infographic. Well, great. I think it's a great infographic that gives different kinds of un-originality, different kinds of mistakes that people can make. And so there is, as I mentioned at the very top, the inadvertent plagiarism. So when somebody has forgotten to properly cite or quote a source. So again, that can happen. When it comes to academic publishing, that makes us as scholars, if we make that kind of mistake, it makes us seem untrustworthy as a researcher. So if we're so lazy and sloppy that we cannot actually attribute the research to the right person, why would we be an authority figure worth listening to? So that's the kind of way in which a scholarly community of peer editors would think about that kind of mistake. Then there's also some sort of student types of unoriginality, and that's where you have students working together, even though it might be a take-home exam. I'll mainly be talking about professional faculty here, but I do have a few short slides on students because I do think globally, but also particularly in Indonesia, we do see that there's such a young demographic of young people coming up through the education system. And if we can get it right with them, by the time they become scholars, all of this behavior is really second nature. So that's partly why I sort of got some attention on students, but principally I'm also talking about academics. Again, the paraphrase plagiarism, so that's when you sum up somebody's words and don't actually attribute them. So as you notice at the beginning, and I was saying, it was really great to have the overview. Dr. Hermancia gave such a good broad view of what's happening in Indonesia. And so I attributed that overview to the person who brought it forward for us, as opposed to saying, we have had a really good overview, or I'm happy to talk about the overview and to say that there are 67 Scopus ranked journals in Indonesia. If I had said that, that wasn't a statistic that I've brought forward. So those are ways in which we can consciously try to create habits so that we aren't making these kinds of mistakes. So we'll talk about all of these as we go through. So I won't spend my entire allotted time on one slide. We have many slides to go through, but this is a good starting point. Again, the obvious word for word plagiarism, where we just copy something outright. Again, that one's a little bit more obvious, and that's one that a lot of the online software, downloadable software, is able to find that similarity. So the word for word plagiarism is very troubling, but it's easier to catch than some of the other ones. Self-plagiarism, again, is one of those things where you present your own work, so it's yours, so you feel like, well, I can't be plagiarizing, it's mine. But you need to recognize where that research may appear in other places, and we'll talk about that again as we go through. Again, source-based plagiarism. So this one's a little bit harder to understand. It's essentially associated, again, with a degree of sloppiness. So if you find research someplace and you haven't made it easy for anybody to go and find that source, it may seem as though that's information that's been falsified. So you want to be sort of careful about that. So, and then again, the sort of specific cheating and falsifying information. So those are the big categories that fall afoul of errors in academic integrity. So as I say, we'll start a little bit looking at academic integrity for students and the kinds of mistakes that students can make and the ways in which we want to overcome those mistakes with and for the students. So the main ways that students engage in dishonest academic behavior is, so number one, by plagiarizing, and that's all those different kinds of plagiarizing. The second is copying, and as I say, that's the one that's typically the software, things like Turnitin, for example, can be quite good at finding, but copying material is still quite common. Contract cheating is probably the largest problem with respect to student work. And contract cheating is essentially where students will pay somebody else to do their work for them. And so that can be anything from hiring somebody to write their essay for them, all the way to having somebody pretend to be them and sit in and write their exam for them. So that's more explicitly fraudulent and very more planned and less likely to be an accident. And then the fourth way that we do see students engaging in dishonest academic behaviors is sometimes they may falsify data. You'll find that less in some of the sort of scientific classes where there are specific experiments that you are having students do. But sometimes if you have qualitative methods or even quantitative data coming in based on surveys, they can falsify that survey data. And again, it may be because they don't know what they don't know and it's an honest mistake. Or it may be that they're lazy and trying to get away with something. So those are some areas that commonly students may fall afoul of. So as I said, the biggest one is with the contract cheating. And this I just pulled up as I was preparing these slides last week. This popped up in my Twitter feed. And again, this is a massive problem in post-secondary. So this is talking about cheating. Not only do students buy essays, but they buy exam writers. There's an entire industry around cheating on the TOEFL. Paper mills are big business. And so that's, as I say, the contract cheating. So not only is this a problem that faculty, academics, lecturers, professors, and teachers try to deal with their students. And in some ways now with COVID more than ever, because in many jurisdictions, universities are not opening up for face-to-face classes or only partially opening up for face-to-face classes. So that does create a number of opportunities for this kind of contract cheating. In some jurisdictions, the UK, for example, this kind of behavior is actually illegal. So it's criminal behavior. So the line between something that is a mere academic offense and that can make you fail your class or be disciplined in some way as a student to something that is actually illegal is starting to close. That gap is starting to close. So here are some tips that I've used in my teaching and that I've shared with other faculty. Now, there are a number of different resources and different tips out there that you can use to help students before we move on to talking about ways in which faculty might need some tips to avoid making mistakes and ensure that they can publish internationally. But with respect to students, the number one tip is to design assignments that are hard to copy. Again, this will depend on your field of study and what it is that you might be teaching, and also the level that you're teaching. So it's if you have postgraduate students, sometimes it's easier to design new assignments than if you have very large classes just at the tertiary level. But if you can design different kinds of assignments that are hard to copy from student to student, that's a good tip. Second, and again, this is not all that practical during the pandemic, depending on what's happening with classes. But if there are kinds of tests and exams that can be done in class, that limits the kind of potential plagiarism or cheating to merely if somebody can see a person beside them. And that's a lot less of a risk factor than if you've got somebody who is able to do a search on Google and find somebody to write their essay for them or to complete their take-home assignment for them. So for instance, in June, that's when the high schools are closing in the United States. And many teachers were having online exams. And the problem was that as these students were doing their online exams, in the exam, because they were at home, they were then able to quickly do hop online and just ask, hey, I need an answer to this question. And tutors and other people were able to provide them those answers. So it was posing some complications for teachers in that context. Number 3 is to teach students that plagiarism is cheating. And as I mentioned, in many countries, it's actually illegal. So again, that's just a straightforward, just like this workshop today, make sure that students have the information around plagiarism so that they can avoid that. Number 4, make sure that they understand that buying schoolwork constitutes plagiarism. So sometimes students will think that if they hire somebody to write their work for them, because that work is new, that's not plagiarism. But of course, anything that they're trying to pretend is theirs, that somebody else wrote, is an instance of plagiarism. But sometimes students don't quite understand that subtlety, that difference. Number 5, teach proper citations. Remember, it's always better to overcite than to undercite. So, and again, we'll continue to talk about various different citation methodologies as we continue through the presentation. But again, making sure to take a moment, whether it's in a handout or a lesson, just to go over citations with students. again, I'm sure as faculty, you're all doing this. So I'm not wanting to give you tips that you don't already know, but just to have all these tips in one place so that at the end, when you take this presentation, all the material is all together, even though some of it will be review for many of you. And then number 6, use an online plagiarism checker to find oversights or mistakes before submitting. And again, Jack a little bit later is going to talk about similarity checker in Turnitin, so that you've got a sense for some of the kind of software tools that are able to do a quick check for inadvertent plagiarism. Now we'll move to section 3. If you remember, there are the 6 sections in this morning's agenda. So this really gets into things for faculty. So academic integrity for faculty. Faculty can engage in dishonest academic behaviors. Of course, none of us would ever do this on purpose, but sometimes it can happen regardless. So faculty can engage in dishonest academic behaviors by, so the first 4 are the same as students: plagiarizing, copying, contract cheating, and falsifying data. Once we are talking about faculty, there are some additional complications that come into play. So for instance, there may be unethical research practices. So when it comes to research with animals or human subjects, there are certain ethical protocols, and again, it depends on your field what those ethical protocols may be, but you need to adhere to those. So for instance, if you're doing research on human subjects, and that may not even be medical research, that may be research just in terms of a questionnaire. And if you, for instance, tell the people who are filling out your questionnaire that you will protect their names and their personal information, and then you don't, and you create a graph that has everybody's name and age and all of that information, that would be an example of doing something unethical. And then the final one, where we've got a question around academic integrity for faculty that is the most common, is improper recognition of team researchers. So improper recognition of researchers. Often this happens in multi-author subjects or multi-author papers, where there may well be a lead investigator who doesn't give credit to people working in the lab with them. So those are some of the common things that happen with respect to academic integrity on the faculty side of things. So let me just quickly check the Q&A to see if there's any, I don't know, won't let me check the Q&A. All right, so I can't check the Q&A while I'm presenting. So just if there's anything in the Q&A that needs to be answered before I go on, just unmute yourself and jump in and let me know if you would, please, Hadiana. So now talking about faculty as well, as I say, not that I do all of my research on Twitter, but I find Twitter is sometimes a good place to take the pulse of what people really feel about things. And so this is a frustrated researcher, and she posted this tweet and said, so I reported a publication I was reviewing for plagiarism. Among others, the publication had almost a verbatim paragraph from a different lab. They just changed the adjective to noun. If it's a student, they fail, get put on academic hold, etc. What happens to authors when it's a journal submission? So again, this is that recognition that, so sometimes journals can get past the peer review phase and be published and then retracted when it becomes clear that there's an error. But often they get caught at this stage. And the difficulty is that you then, your reputation as a researcher gets somewhat sullied because you have peer reviewers, the people globally speaking who are the global members of your field, who you want to research with, who you want to collaborate with. And if they are the ones who see your work come in and find that it has these examples of plagiarism or other ethical problems with respect to the academic integrity of your research, that can be really devastating to your own work and your own career and your own career trajectory. It can also, and it's horrible to say this, but different places globally have better or worse records and reputations when it comes to academic scholarship. And you definitely would not want to make the world think that Indonesian scholars can't do good work, because that's absolutely untrue. There is such good research and scholarship coming out of Indonesia. So you want to make sure that the global stage sees and appreciates that research. So this gets us to this point that the stakes are so much higher for faculty and professional academics when it comes to academic integrity. So for students, obviously it's terrible to get a failing grade, and obviously it's embarrassing if they get a black mark and they get disciplined for falling afoul of something with respect to their mistakes that they make as a student vis-a-vis academic integrity. But for faculty, so much of what we do as scholars is we build our reputations as excellent scholars. And part of being an excellent scholar means that we're not making these kinds of mistakes with respect to academic integrity. And so if we do make those kinds of mistakes, we risk our work being redacted, we risk our scholarly reputations, we risk being disciplined. So the stakes are certainly quite high. And this gets us to now the kind of meat of what I consider to be my presentation. So, I mean, obviously, sections 1, 2, and 3 are important and excellent, but you'll find sections 4, 5, and 6 are the more practical. What can you do? What are some of the tips and tricks to avoid sort of making those mistakes? So first, we're going to look at international journals. And again, Pak Lukman gave such a good snapshot into the different databases where these international journals can be found, the standards for international publishing. And I'll be picking up on and echoing some of what he had to say as we look at the kind of international publishing framework. And again, as academics, international publishing in top-ranked journals is how we, in our own jobs, if we're, so I shouldn't even say we anymore. So I'm not full-time faculty anymore. I used to be. Now I'm adjacent to full-time faculty. My husband, of course, is still a full-time faculty member. So I feel like I can use the we, even though it's a more inclusive we at this point in my career. But as academics, we want to be promoted, presumably. And importantly, and this, again, it differs from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but there is money to be had for research and scholarship. And so that can be money at the state level, at the national level, at the institution level. But there's also international grants. And so the more we publish in top-ranked international journals, the more competitive we are in that broader framework with respect to academic publishing, research, and scholarship, and being able to secure finance for future projects in our field. And then the important piece over and above, wanting to get promoted, wanting to secure financing and funding, whether it's locally or abroad. But as researchers, one of our main goals is to contribute to the global community of scholars and the global effort to increase and improve knowledge in the world. So we're not just doing our research because it's neat or doing our research because it's interesting to us, although it may be neat and interesting to us. We're trying to contribute to an international dialogue with other people in our field. And what, to me, is really exciting about this moment in time is that, everybody is used to working internationally now. So all of the journals, all of the research, all of that happens online. Peer review happens online. The editing happens online. The dissemination of information happens online. As evidenced by this morning, we can all get together online. So the community of scholarship really can be quite international, which is very exciting. I was just realizing this morning when I was preparing to attend today, last year I had the good fortune of being invited to speak about education technology and research methodology in Yogyakarta. And it was wonderful, and I got to go in person and eat wonderful food. So this morning, it is wonderful to be with you all virtually. But of course, I'm sitting here in Canada as opposed to being in Indonesia. It does make it exciting because this is certainly possible, and it does allow for that community. But as I say, it was lovely to actually get to be in Yogyakarta in person. So I'll just throw that out there. And then the final piece before I move on from this slide, again, just to reiterate, and I'm probably repeating myself a little bit, but the key thing to remember with respect to academic integrity as academics is that as academics, our aim and our goal is to build our research and our scholarship, obviously. But in so doing, we want to build our reputation as good scholars. And part of being a good scholar is being an ethical scholar. So you can't be a good scholar if you are falsifying data, if you are plagiarizing from other people, if you are not attributing work to your co-authors appropriately, all of those sorts of things. So academic integrity is actually really important to the development and production of scholarship. So as I say, that's why I wanted to add those slides in about the students, because I really do, believe that if we can get it right and if we can train the next generation of thinkers and researchers and scholars and scientists to have these practices ingrained in them, then it's better for everybody when they become the professional academics. So again, this is picking up on some of what we've already heard this morning, which is, and I've sort of done it at a really high level. And again, this is reiterating, as somebody who's not Indonesian and I'm coming as an outsider, providing you this very clear outsider view. And I have done lots of peer review and worked on editorial boards for magazines. And so the expectation, or journals, I should say, the expectation of international journals are that materials are submitted for peer review and they have data that are not falsified and all proper research has been cited. So as a first baseline, that's the expectation. So anything that is ever submitted to secondary scholars and researchers who will provide peer review, their assumption is that that research is true and accurate, and everybody who is supposed to be cited has been cited. So if in the peer review process, the scholars discover that that's not true and the data does not seem to be accurate and that there are gaps in the citation, that'll be a red flag, which if everything else is great, then the paper may just need to be revised. But it's quite possible that at that point, the reviewer will be uninterested in recommending that paper for publication. So again, that's something that's well within our control to make sure that our data is accurate and that we're citing the research that needs to be cited in our papers. The second baseline expectation at the International Journal sort of editorial board and peer review level is that materials submitted for peer review have been proofread, spell checked, and polished before submission. So again, partly what we do as researchers and scholars is that we're wanting to demonstrate that we are the authorities in our field and that we are the researchers to be taken seriously. And so by ensuring that we use, whether it's, as mentioned earlier, whether it's Grammarly or any of the other tools available to do that proofreading, spell checking, and polish before submission, the expectation of the journal and the peer reviewers is that they're providing their scholarly insights as a reviewer. They're not providing their sort of mechanical, technical review at that level of sort of proofreading, spell checking, and grammar. So that's the second, like, you want to make sure that that is handled and handled well before you send something off for peer review. The third element that is just a general expectation by an international journal, an editorial board, or their peer reviewers is that materials submitted for peer review adhere to the writing conventions of scientific writing. And I'll go through that a little bit more. And that was touched on as well before. Pak Lukman certainly gave us that kind of snapshot of the component parts of the scientific paper. The abstract is a little bit outside, but then you've got all of the component parts of your scientific paper, your scientific writing, your academic writing in that vein. I'll just pause here for a moment. Are there any questions that I need to answer at this point? Check the Q&A box for me because it somehow, as I'm presenting, it doesn't seem to let me check. Let's see. All right. Assuming not, I will continue on. So hopefully my screen is still sharing. So now we get to, I've sort of given that whole overview. So now we're looking at how do we cite somebody else's ideas. So we've had the sort of table stakes, so to speak, in terms of the expectations of international journal. And if that first point is to make sure that all research that needs to be cited has been cited, how do we cite? And again, some of this, I shouldn't say some of this, a lot of this is review. The point is to have the information consolidated in one clear space so that you've got this research as a set of resources that you can use going forward. Again, and that you may, in your own teaching, choose to use some of this with your students as well as having it as a resource for your own scholarly practice. So a citation style is a set of rules on how to cite sources in academic writing. Citation styles vary, so you have to check with the journal to see what one they prefer, and then I've listed some of the main ones. And so again, a citation style is essentially where you put the name and date of the author that you're going to be quoting or citing. And different journals, different university publication houses, different scholarly presses. They all have their different conventions. Typically in the humanities, so when I was publishing work as a literary scholar, as an English scholar, I shouldn't say when I was, I have an article that is overdue. I was supposed to submit it to my editor on Friday and I haven't. So I'll get it to her this Friday. But so I'm still living this experience. And so MLA is typically what we use in the humanities. APA is often for psychology and education. I also publish in educational research, and that's APA. So again, they're very similar, but where the comma is in terms of the parentheses and how it is placed is ever so slightly different. Chicago Manual of Style, often in history. And then Chicago author date is very common in the sciences. So I'll give you an example out of those four. I've just, instead of going through every single one, because that's sort of fairly straightforward information, but I wanted to pull out one to give an example as a way of illustrating ways to avoid inadvertent plagiarism. So again, the Chicago author date in the sciences is typically the author date style. You cite the sources in parentheses in the text. The citation includes the author's last name followed by the year of publication with no punctuation in between. So for example, Smith, 2012. Then if you refer to a specific part of the text, particularly when quoting or paraphrasing, you should also add a page number or page range to direct the reader to the relevant passage. The page number appears after a comma. So in the example, Smith, 2012, 21 to 22. So what that means is, for instance, if, say, I'm writing about the research of Smith, and I say, oh, in Smith's study, he found whatever it is that he found out. In that case, I may just have Smith 2012 in parentheses because I'm talking about the whole study. But then if there's a specific data point or a specific insight that I want to pull out and I say, when Smith designed his experiment, he overlooked people aged 2 to 5. And so perhaps that I want to refer to that specific passage on page 21 to 22 where he details the construction of his experiment that I'm presumably taking issue with. So those are just to give you some examples, some practical ways in which you can cite those other researchers in your own writing. And if you remember, one of those 6 tips for students is that it's better to overcite than to undercite. And that is in some ways quite similar even for academics as well. So, quickly being able to identify the researchers who have traveled the terrain or the landscape just before you have, that can be really sort of just helpful to demonstrate that you've done your research and that they've traveled that terrain before you. Sort of continuing on with this Chicago author date approach. So you've got the name and the year, or the name, year, and page. And then there are a couple of other points worth drawing out. A citation usually appears at the end of the relevant clause, sentence, or quotation, before any concluding punctuation. If multiple citations are needed at the same point, they should appear in the same set of parentheses separated by a semicolon. Unless you are a grammar nerd like me, that is probably very boring to you. All of it just simply means that save those parentheses with the name and the date until the kind of a break in the sentence. So don't just plop those parentheses with the name and the date, in between 2 words. Kind of wait until there's a comma or wait until there's a period and then put that information in. So like, for instance, in the example on the slide, for the final citation, McDonald 2018, it says, but new evidence suggests this consensus may be mistaken. I'm not putting the McDonald 2018 right after new evidence. It's coming at the end. So that's, again, it's just a stylistic point, but it's a stylistic point that bears attending to. And then the final piece on this slide, if the researcher's name is already mentioned in the text, the citation should appear straight after it and include only the date along with the page number if relevant. So Smith argues that there is reason to believe this method has great potential. However, Johnson's experiment fails to bear out this assertion. And so what that means is all we're doing is putting the reference, in this case, the year and the page right after the author's name, simply so that then when I check the bibliography, it's quick and easy for me as a peer reviewer or me as a reader to find that other source. And it also, in the moment, and this is particularly important with respect to science papers. So typically in scientific research, if you're citing research that's more than, typically they say, 6 to 7 years, but sometimes there's delays in publication. So there's a window in there. But if you're citing research that's really older than 10 years, you probably want to have a good reason for citing research that is older than 10 years old. And so by having that date right beside the name, it helps a reader to then say, oh, okay, so that research was from 2012, but the later research from 2015 contradicted it. So it helps as you read to make sense of the chronology of the scholarship that's been developing in the particular field. All right, so now we've said, great, we know the different types of academic dishonesty. There are ways in which people can make mistakes, inadvertently not cite somebody. We've sort of had some strategies for overcoming that. We know how to cite, we know where to cite. But what happens if you have done your research, you believe you're done, you've done your research, you've conducted, whether it's your own experimentation, you've read scholarship, you write it up. How do you know that you're not missing something major? This is one of those areas that I think all scholars worry about, that somehow somebody else has done the work that you're doing and you have just not found it or not discovered it. So there are a couple of quick ways, assuming you've already done your research, assuming you think that you've covered everything off. There are some quick ways that you can start to check to make sure that you aren't missing anything. And interestingly, the ways to check international scholarship in your field to see what else is being said in your field, just to make sure that you haven't missed anything at the end, is also a good place to start if you're starting a new research project. So, both as a final check to see that there's nothing you've missed, but also when you start to begin thinking about your research and you want to survey, what's been done, what's been said, what's going on in my field. So again, the first and most obvious is to do a quick Google Scholar search, particularly if what you're wanting to do is a quick scan to see if there's something that you've missed. So for instance, I have an article that I'm working on, educational technology in higher education. So that's why I use that as the search on my screen capture. So even without actually clicking on and reading any of these articles, I can see their quick abstract and get a sense for whether or not they're related to the things that I'm thinking about and whether or not it's worth having a close look. I can also see how often they've been cited. So that gives me just a very quick survey in terms of whether this research is well known or not. So again, I'm not saying Google Scholar should be your one-stop shop for all your research. It shouldn't be the only tool, but it can certainly be a powerful tool in your toolkit, particularly when it comes to wanting to double check that you haven't missed something. And again, avoid that inadvertent plagiarism where somebody else maybe cited, over 1,000 times for something, and you've just not come across that work and you're making a very similar claim. You want to make sure that you've incorporated that in, and you said, oh, okay, in this wonderful study by this person, they found out whatever it is that they found out, and add that in and layer that into your own research. The next and most obvious is to check JSTOR database. Again, there are many others, but these, because again, it depends what kind of access your institution has to all of the different databases globally. And so you may not have access to everything. Whereas I did this Google Scholar just from my home computer. So you can do a search outside of a university or college library. You can have a sort of quick look and get that sense of the landscape and make sure you've not made a mistake. Similarly with JSTOR, in terms of ultimately being able to dig in and access these, you'll need library access through your institution. But being able to search, so in this search I did education technology and higher education, there's over 300,000 search results that come up that I can just scroll through and see which ones are going to be relevant for me. So again, those are two I find very handy, very easy to use databases when it comes to at the end of your research and you want to check to make sure you haven't missed anything. So you can enter in the key search terms of your research and just double check. Or similarly, if you're starting a very new project, you can enter in your key search terms and see what are the dominant voices in your field that come up through these sort of two searches. And again, that's where, from my perspective, I find it really exciting that we do live in this global world because, back when I was a young student and just starting out in the pre-internet era, I was limited to what I could research in a physical library. And so going through a library, whatever journals happened to be in that particular library, whereas now we're able to do these quick searches of reliable global databases, and same goes for graduate research as well. So as I say, these are some quick and easy tips and tricks in thinking about the international journal landscape and what the expectations are. So in order to publish your own work in these journals, the authors and the peer reviewers are expecting that you're familiar with this whole landscape. They're expecting that you've done that survey of what else is being said in your particular field. So now we've said, okay, great. We want to avoid plagiarism. Academic integrity is important. It's good for our careers. It's good for scholarship. We need to protect our reputations. We need to make sure that we're citing people. We know how to quickly check either at the end or the beginning of our research to ensure that we're not missing anything. Now let's say that piece of writing that we're working on is ready to go. And there are a variety of different places where you can submit that work. And so I'll give you, again, a sort of outsider's look. It is exciting, particularly if you are more comfortable with your academic writing in Bahasa. It is exciting that there are some excellent journals in Indonesia that you can submit your research to. Many of the international ranked journals, like I think if we the directory of open access journals that that Dr. Hermancia showed us this morning. I think, the number of journals in the DOAJ in Indonesia was roughly equivalent to that in the UK. And when you're thinking about the populations of those two countries, I mean, it's ridiculous. You dwarf the UK like crazy. I mean, they're nothing compared to the Indonesian population. But in terms of the number of journals, and in part, what we see too is that often the international journal language of publication is often English. And so if you're thinking about publishing your work in an English language journal, that's the kind of insight that I'm going to give you in this next little bit about finding the international journals to submit your work to. And it's largely because that's the arena that I'm more comfortable and more familiar with. I shouldn't say more comfortable. I'm more familiar with what that landscape looks like. So again, I like to give very quick and easy tips. I'm sure you are all wonderful and amazing scholars. Sometimes I'm very busy and I want to find the quickest and easiest way. And so these that's what motivates some of my tips in this talk, is to use the tools that are readily available that may not cost anything for just a quick search, so that you can start to understand and allocate your research in the right place. So for instance, Elsivier, which I'm sure you've all heard of, it's this giant monolith for publishing globally. But one of the tools that they have online is the Journal Finder. And it's just a very quick, you enter in your paper title, your abstract, a couple of other fields, and then it will produce a report of the kinds of journals in their database that might be a good place to publish. Again, it is just limited to the Elsevier world of journals, but they have so many of them that it is a good, quick place to begin finding a home for your research if you want your research to reach that external audience. And so this is, so for instance, the reason I've put this up here as sort of a helpful tip is because you can start looking at this even before you've done that final polish of your piece of academic writing. So once, for instance, you know that you're producing a paper for publication, you've got an experiment, you've got a survey, you've got some research that you're conducting. Once you've already started to think through that, you can even start using this Journal Finder tool at that point. And if it turns out that there are a couple of journals that seem interesting to you, you can start to already tailor how you write your article for the particular journal that you're thinking of. So if you type in the parameters of your research here, something comes up, you check out the journal, it sounds like it's a good fit for you. You can already look at what is their citation format. You can look at other articles that they've published and kind of get a feel for the style they like, so that, again, with your own writing, you're writing in a way that is going to have the sort of best chance of finding a happy home in the best international journal for your research. So if you kind of assume that all of us are producing these little amazing bits of research, we want our amazing bits of research to go off in the world and make the world a better place. And so sometimes these journals with a big reach can be that happy home for that research. And that big reach is what takes us to this next, the second last section for today's presentation. And again, this was touched on a bit earlier today, is this important notion of the impact factor. So often research is judged by its impact factor, which refers to a number of things: the ranking of the journal, the number of citations, and the reach of the journal. As a scholar, you want your research and journals you publish in to have a high impact factor, i.e., most likely that your work will be cited a lot by others. And so that's, so as I was just saying when we were sort of looking here, and I was saying you can find a happy home for your research. And that happy home is shaped by this idea that you want your work to be cited. And I believe, and you're more than welcome to disagree with me, but I believe often we want our work to be cited, I mean, not just because it is nice, it makes us feel good to think somebody's reading our work, but ultimately we want our work to be cited because it means it is making an impact on the world. It means that our little piece of knowledge production is helping humanity. And so if other people are citing it, they're taking our little piece of knowledge production and they're building and building and building. And I find that very exciting. And so again, if you do good research and you publish somewhere where nobody will ever see it, your little bit of knowledge production doesn't actually help to add anything to humanity as a whole because it's not being read. So that's why this notion of impact factor matters. So that's one reason why it matters. The second reason why this notion of impact factor matters is a pragmatic reason. And that's typically because, again, just as I said, publishing in international journals is helpful in terms of our own promotions and securing grants and funding. This idea of the impact factor and citations and the impact of our work is important in no small part because it is meaningful and helpful for our career. So if we publish in places that have a high impact factor, that are well-respected journals with a good reach, then our work as well will be impactful in that vein. So what is impact factor? Again, this is a bit of a summary. And as per usual, when I've brought in information that is not strictly my own, I've provided the link and the citation for where you can find that research so that, again, you can dig in and have a peek and get more information. So the impact factor is a measure of the frequency with which the average article in a journal has been cited in a particular year. It is used to measure the importance or rank of a journal by calculating the times its articles are cited. So how is impact factor calculated? The calculation is based on a 2-year period and involves dividing the number of times articles were cited by the number of articles that are citable. All of that just says that basically there's a big database and you can sort of plug in and check these various journals to see what their impact factor is, and then for your own research within that. There are a couple of different places that, again, easily calculate journal impact factors. Again, I've given the links to some of the main ones. There are many others. So there are various tools to determine or help figure out a journal's impact factor and thus whether it will be valuable for you as a place to publish your research. We've got a few different places for you to see. Again, excuse me, I just find it helpful because there's sort of a large strategy at play here. And the strategy is such that you begin with the desire, either professionally or personally, to conduct research of some sort. And then upon conducting that research, it's the move to create output for that research. So a written paper or book. And then in doing the written paper or book, there's this large community that you need to ensure that you're engaged with, and that's the citations and the research and the scholarship. And then there's where's the happy place and the best place to find the home for that work once it is out of your hands. And calculating the journal impact factor can help you figure that out in terms of getting the biggest bang for your buck, so to speak. And being able to say, okay, if I submit to that journal and I can get through the peer review process, that will be valuable to me because that journal has a high impact factor, which may be something that your institution cares about. And importantly, it may also mean that your work becomes part of the broader conversation in your field. So now we get to the sort of,
yeah, I beg your pardon. Let me remind you that your presentation is 5 minutes left, then we can open Q&A.
Yep, perfect. Thank you. I was just going to say, as you can see, we're at the takeaway publishing tips, so section 6, the end. And this is the what are the expectations for writing a scholarly piece to be published internationally with a high impact factor. So we've said, all right, we want to do things that are in keeping with academic integrity. We want to research. We want to cite properly. We want to find the right journal. And we want our research to get out there. So what are the expectations at the level of writing? So if you recall, I said the expectations in terms of the basic expectations that the research is true and accurate, that everybody's cited who needs to be cited, that it's been proofread, all of those basic things. But now at the level of what actually does one of these journal articles look like, or what actually is going to put you in the best stead in terms of this publication. The most important piece, and again, this is a way to help address questions around academic integrity at the writing and composition point, not just at the end. So I am of the full belief that if you can get these pieces right, then it's less likely you'll make the mistakes in terms of academic integrity at the end by potentially not citing somebody you're supposed to cite. So the one main tip is getting the structure right. So academic, particularly science writing, has specific sections that journal editors and peer reviewers will be looking for in addition to your list of academic and scholarly citations, proving that you are adhering to the expectations of academic integrity. And so that, again, as I say, if you get the structure right, it's most likely that you'll make fewer of the mistakes. I don't know why I keep saying that you will make the mistakes. These mistakes might happen. We all can fall afoul of this. So again, this is a broad summary. Academic papers that report experimental findings or research often will have the following 5 sections: an introduction, a materials and methods, sometimes called methodology and approach, a results, a discussion, and a conclusion section. And again, so these can be science papers, it could be quantitative, it could be qualitative, it could be experimental, but ultimately if you've collected data of some sort and are reporting your data in some fashion, you will want to do it in this way. So the next few slides, I'll just sort of quickly flag clues for where you can cite, and that can sort of proactively get ahead of some of the problems that can emerge with respect to academic integrity. So in the introduction, you want to situate your work within the field and explain your reason for studying whatever you've studied. So if you're writing about some research finding in education technology and higher ed, great. Situate that as your introduction and then cite other related scholarly research. Again, I've sort of pulled out a quotation here. In a nutshell, if you provide a clear introductory section that sets up your topic and the specific problem or point that you will explore, then your readers will know what to expect. By including a good introduction, you are showing your readers as well as telling them that you are an authority they can trust. After all, first impressions matter. Now, the reason I've included that quotation there is because if you look at the citation at the bottom, oh, that's me. I didn't self-plagiarize. I actually put it as a quotation and provided that footnote. And so again, many of you are extraordinarily well-published and very, very good scholars in your own field. So you may already have things out there in the world, and you can refer to those, probably not exclusively. You need to have some other quotations in there as well. But so long as you reference where your other work can be found, that's how you can avoid self-plagiarism. Second section is the materials and methods, or the methodology and approach section. And this explains the nature of your experiment or research. So what did you do? What were the variables or the parameters? And then again, in red, it's how does your research differ from other experiments that are related? And can you cite them? So again, as you set up and you can say, okay, so I did whatever your experiment, I conducted a survey. There were 500 survey participants. They were given 100 questions. I ran the survey over a period of 2 weeks. Let's say that, so I'm outlining that's the experiment that I engaged in. And I might say, this methodology is different from this other scholar who ran a survey over 1 day as opposed to a longer period of time, or whatever those parameters are. That's where you can situate your work in the field. Once again, I've quoted that Lindi Ledohowski lady. How do researchers in your fields do their work? Is it data intensive, close reading, theoretical, historical, etc.? Each discipline has its own way of doing things, and most fields even have differences within their fields. Not all scholars do work the same way. Clearly state the scope of your research, especially if it is informed by a standard or well-known approach. The third section, and this is the sort of sets up what you found out. So it's the results, articulates the outcome of your research, explain what happened in your experiment or data set. So that's, again, I had a questionnaire. The questionnaire went out to this number of people, and then I'll say, and this is what I found out. So you just explain the results, and then you get to the meat of your scientific paper, which is the discussion, also known as the analysis. This is where you are providing your own personal input on the results. So you're ultimately saying, okay, so if in the methods section, I did a survey, here were the people I surveyed, this is how long the survey ran. The results were, this is what I found out when I did the survey. The discussion is, this is why it's interesting. So it was unexpected, it was whatever it is that was interesting. And that's, again, where you can cite other research and show how you are contributing to this broader field. And then the final section of your paper is the conclusion. And this section sums up the important insights of your work and indicates areas for further research. This is the most important, or not the most, this is one of the most important parts, because this is where you can cite other related studies, avenues for potential collaboration. What is the big idea? Why does it matter? Where can we go with our research from here? So now we get to the very second last slide of the entire presentation. And this, again, is sort of summing up this key takeaway. Academic integrity is important because by using other people's work as our own, as faculty or students, we are engaged in fraud. There's enough fake news out there. Let's be part of the solution, not the problem. So now I will stop here and open it up for questions.
Okay, thank you, Lindi, for your amazing presentation. Here we have questions from attendees, and I will read for you. I will separate the question into sections.
Okay.
Section 1, there are 3 questions, and the first one, I'd like to read question from our live streaming YouTube. The question from Mr. Suwardi: how to foster scientific writing skills in international journal and avoiding plagiarism when you want to be published. You want to ask one by one, or?
Yeah, we can, if you want to just go one by one, and I'll answer quickly. Okay. Is that okay?
Okay, please.
Okay, so that and thank you for that from YouTube. So many of the things in the whole presentation try to give strategies and tactics for how to publish internationally and avoiding plagiarism. So the main one would be to cite as many scholars as possible and make sure that you check and survey that you've not missed anything. And then, of course, a final check is to use Turnitin and other similarity checkers to make sure that your work is not too similar to anybody else's work. Okay, next question.
Okay, thank you. Second question from Nurlaila Marabesi. Can you share your experience, how university and government handling this academic dishonesty? Maybe your experience in Canada.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, how are universities and governments handling academic dishonesty? So there's a number of different ways. As I say, in some places, they're starting to crack down on it and make it illegal. In Canada, typically what you find is most institutions have a person that's called their academic integrity officer, and they are empowered to investigate questions of academic integrity that come forward. So professors and teaching assistants and lecturers will often report instances of academic dishonesty, and then it goes up through the administration, and students can get a permanent record, they can get expelled, they can get disciplined. And similarly, if it's a case of faculty, you can be disciplined, stripped of your professional rank. If, for instance, if you were promoted to full professor and it comes out afterwards that some of your work was plagiarized, then that's certainly problematic. But the bigger thing is it's this thing about reputation. So once your name online is associated, say, with work that's been redacted or with a claim that it's been plagiarized, it's very hard to be taken seriously as a scholar after that. So yeah, it's a problem the world over. Okay, next.
Okay. Next question is from Bapak Radit Teguh Handalani. The question is, he is a section editor, how we identify the publication and falsification activities in articles which are submitted in our journals. So Pak Radit is a section editor.
Yeah, so again, many of the tips as an editor that you will want to engage in is often a first step is to, again, check the list of citations. From the citations, so say something gets submitted and you're deciding whether it's going to go out to peer review or not. So the first thing you can check, just go and see if you can find any of the citations. And if you can't, then there may be something fraudulent. Secondly, do a Google Scholar search for whatever the article says it's about. Do a quick search and see if there's anything that pops up on Google that isn't in that article. And those are some very quick ways to get a high-level idea of whether or not you even then want to send that out for peer review at that level. Another strategy as a journal editor is that you can have really strict guidelines before somebody's able to submit to you, and that's up to you in terms of making it really clear that they have to adhere to that sort of scientific writing structure, and then check for that when it is submitted.
Okay, next question. The next question from Bapak Agus Gumilar. This question is quite long. How to educate the academic society as not to commit plagiarism? Is there a better way than to punish people who commit plagiarism? Yeah, and so I do think there's a better way than simply punishing people who commit plagiarism offenses. So as I say, I believe that that everybody wants to do good work and we may make mistakes. And so that's why I don't love the punishment route. I tend to focus on if you can do the things at the beginning right. So citing your sources, doing a quick search for related research and incorporating that, adhering to the structure for science writing and putting in the appropriate quotes in the right sections, that all helps to overcome some of the mistakes in academic integrity problems.
so that you're sort of addressing it at the beginning as opposed to just waiting till the end and punishing. The second part of the question, which is educating people around what constitutes plagiarism, I think that's just we're all in part of this long journey together. So you're here at this webinar. Turnitin has partnered with Ristek Brin to bring this forward. They brought in somebody like me to give you some resources, and then you can pass that on to your students and your colleagues. And I think we all just continue to participate in these kind of educational activities. Next.
Okay. Next question still from Pak Agung Gumilar. I once read on ResearchGate that articles that have been published to the conference may be published again in a journals. There is another opinion that this publication can be published in a journal as long as there has been a chance of at least 40% of the journal content. What do you think about this opinion?
Yeah, so, and again, it differs on the journal to journal. So typically speaking, that's right, that anything 30 to 40% as a minimum that then has to be changed from different versions. So if conference proceedings were published, and then, I want to say, take my piece of that published conference proceeding and turn it into a journal article and publish it, so long as the write-up is significantly different. So the data set might still be the same, but we may expand the research. And that's, again, often the way we expand that research from a conference presentation to a journal article is more citations, more research into the field. And so if you, say, had something and you presented your findings at a conference, changed it, and published it in a journal article, typically, again, 30 to 40% is usually what's required in order for that to be published. The main thing is that journals don't want to publish stuff that's already out there. What is the point of them publishing findings that exist somewhere else? So you want to show how the second publishing of your findings is significantly different from it in the academic conference. So that's my perspective. I do believe that we should be able to get our work out there in many different places, so long as it's not the exact same articulation of the research. All right, next.
Okay, thank you, Lindi. And then how and where public can report fraud publication? Maybe are there?
Oh, you know what? I wish I had a good answer for that. I don't actually think there's a good place for reporting fraudulent publications. So there's sort of two kinds of fraudulent publications. One is when you find something that's been written that itself is fraudulent or wrong, in which case you report it to the journal and say, hey, this seems to be fraudulent or wrong. The second is when the journal itself seems to be fraudulent. There's no reputation of that journal. And that is where you tend to have to count on like other scholars around you. And then again, these larger international databases, because if those journals don't appear as say like a Scopus listed journal, it may I could start a journal from my house and I could tell you all to submit, and it could be absolute garbage. And you wouldn't want to put your good work in that made up journal that I had just, invented. You would want to put it in something a little bit more scholarly. But unfortunately, there are a lot of these bad predatory journals out there. So again, just doing some quick Google searching to see if anybody else is published in those journals, if there are any names that you can look up. So if a journal, for instance, doesn't publish its editorial board, like who's the editor of the journal, who helps to make those decisions, and if there aren't names that you can then do a Google search and find that that's a real person and a real person who's presumably a professor, that would be a warning flag for me. Again, it's not a place to report that fraudulent journal, but it can help you to not waste time and energy giving them your good work.
Okay, thank you. And then next, the question comes from Riris Diana Rahmayati. What's your opinion when we cited our articles, self-citation? It's same with self-plagiarism, or how is strategy to reduce self-plagiarism?
Yeah, so personally, my opinion is that self-citing isn't wrong. I mean, self-plagiarism is, so you want to make sure that you cite yourself. The only risk with self-citing is that it can make it seem like you're too limited. So I'll give you a real example. So in some of my published scholarship, I have had to cite some of my other published scholarship because I was the only person who had done that particular piece of work. But I wanted to make sure that I had also cited a bunch of other people, so it didn't just sound like, well, as Lindi Ledohowski said here, and in order to quote Lindi Ledohowski here, and Lindi Ledohowski, then it just seems like all my research is Lindi, 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 Lindi. And that's not a long way of saying, I think self-citing carefully and not too much is fine, so long as you don't cite yourself more than you cite everybody else who's in your field. Self-plagiarism, so again, this gets back to that like percentage. You want your work that you're putting forward to be significantly new work. So you don't want to recycle old work and pretend as though it's new.
Okay, last but not least, the last question from Pak Dede Renopaldi. Is it possible to use some of your data to be published in a proceeding? Then you submit your full data, including the data in that proceeding, in the article journals. Is it kind of plagiarism?
No, so that's actually typically that's what happens. So long as, again, you have a footnote that says, you know, the data was first presented and published in the article or the conference proceedings. So if you, let's say you discover your data, you collect your data, you present it, it's published, and then you want to publish it again, so long as you're not publishing the exact same thing, the data set might be the same. I mean, there's only so many experiments a person can do in the span of a year. So we may be building insights on the same data set over time. So where it needs to be different is, if you remember in the scientific paper breakdown, where you've got the introduction, the methodology section, the results, and then the discussion. So long as your discussion section is bringing forward new and different insights, then you can publish sort of the same kind of data set. And again, you want to make sure that you cite it and recognize that it came out first someplace else.
Okay, thank you so much, Lindi. As Pak Lukman said earlier, that Indonesia has received bad worldwide attention regarding this publication ethics. So we hope that your presentation will open our action to be more careful in making